Hi everybody, my name is Tomas Sala. I am the creator of a game called the Falconeer and a new game called Boomwork. And today I want to have a chat about the following. Creating and evolving your art style. I think within our industry we often look at an art style for a game as something to pick and choose, you know, like from the tree. What do we want? You know, you have a new game, a new prototype, and it's, you know, oh, that art style is cool. That's cool. Look, this game, what they did, that's cool. Can we do something like that? And an art style becomes like a consumable object, you know, something just to drop onto your game. I've been working in my art style for about a decade across multiple games, prototypes, games for other studios, and I've stuck with it. I don't do anything else. I just work on that very singular, strangely confined, specific art style for myself. And that's been very beneficial. And that's what I want to talk about today. Where it started. So before I did this, I'm fairly conventional 3D game developer. I used to make mods for fun in my spare time. And as a 3D artist, I'd sculpt them and then I'd wrap them. And I'd create the normal maps and all the, you know, everything you do today was there 10 years ago in 2012 as well. And I found that enjoyable, but it took a lot of time. It was very labor intensive and it puts you into a production mode rather into creation mode. And it sort of nagged at me. After that, around that time, I started evolving in a much simpler art style, an art style that is very limited, specifically focused on colors and gradients and not on detail. Well, not geometrical detail, because that's easy and fun, but not, you know, being as clean as possible. And I did, you know, there's screenshots from various games here. You can see the prototype for the Falconeer upright, stuff that's never been released, like on the left. The birth card for my firstborn son on the right. It has become a very personal thing to do, to stay in this art style and to evolve it over, you know, about a decade. And it's been very satisfying, strangely, for someone who's, you know, quite chaotic and likes new things all the time, to be, you know, on this. It's been very positive. My art style is very specific. I've given myself a very limited set of rules. So as opposed to the normal mapped high detail photorealism, or, well, you know, hyper-realism, or whatever you want to call it. I said, you know, let me make a game or an art style without using any textures or pre-generated textures, because you always have rendered textures, but nothing made in Photoshop or Substance Designer. Just, you know, the geometry, the shading, some fancy shaders in this case, you know, and do it to the GUI sprites as well. You know, once I'm all in. There is no sprites, no textures whatsoever in my games. Even the GUI or user experience UX you see is a three-dimensional geometry with all the same tricks as the characters in the world. I use lots of vertex colors and vertex alpha to input, you know, the base colors and some lighting data, which is simplified but, you know, very useful. And I use lots of fairly complicated shaders to achieve some of the tricks you would normally use textures for. I'll also generate Perlin noise or something if I need it for something. But mostly I'll stick to, you know, using math, you know, let's say turning UV quartz into a gradient or using sine waves and stuff like that. We'll get into that a bit later. It's a simple rule set. I think it came about because back in those times, you had, you know, the first radiosity renders. Everybody was rendering gray characters with just fancy lights or just radiosity. I thought, that's pretty. Maybe you can make an entire game just off that. It's so honest and clean. So I started doing that, and this is what, you know, so I tried to find some older artwork. These are some tiles for strategy games I never released. But you can see it's very simple geometry, and the only thing it has is some radiosity, vertex colors, and a Fresnel or, you know, rim light. That's it. You know, there's some highlights with lava, which is just painted on with vertex colors. There's some real-time shadows, and that's basically it. It's just gray. I thought that looked smashing the first time I looked at it. I thought, wow, that's interesting. and I've stuck with it ever since. How do I, make my stuff? I use very simple modeling techniques. Some people call it low poly, but it's definitely not the same. As you can see, I use as much detail as I want. In the newer stuff, I use a lot more detail, but never more than I need. So that's my rule, as little as I can get away with. The thing that is distinct from low poly, as it were, is I use smoothing groups, which are very important to me, which you can see in the middle and the top right image. You can see that it's not faceted like regular low poly, where you see all the triangles and stuff. I think that's brutish, but every smoothing group, every selection of triangles is smoothed together to create this faceted shit. Yeah, not faceted, but these strips, as it were. And I the first time I did that, I thought, wow, that's interesting. I can sculpt in a different way than before, but it's still sculpting with lights, color gradients, and shadows. And then I add, some radiosity lighting to it, and I use tricks like on the bottom right, UV coordinates. I map something just very simply, and then can use the vertical component as part of the interpolation between gray and red and create colors across a model. Oh, so sorry. Here's a shot of one of the first game I made with this, which was called Oberon's Court, and I never released. It's a very simple way of doing things. It's a very limited palette. I discovered that works wonderfully. It's just geometry with some, like I said, radiosity, and then there's a world position shader that goes purple to orange. Orange on the tops of mountains and hills, purple at the bottom, and black even lower. And there's some tricks, and once you have these, because you can only use a few colors, or you automatically get to this refined, simple palette. And it becomes a challenge because you've limited yourself. It's a challenge towards yourself. So how can I add more contrast to it without breaking my palette? So, add some purple flags. And suddenly it becomes stand out. Whereas in the entire image, there's not a lot of colors, not a lot of stuff going on. But I love the way how this looked. So because there's detail and photorealism is out the door, you have to, you can sort of be forced to do things in a new way, for myself at least. You can do the same for UX and effects as well. You can use sine waves to do animation. So that sine wave, like here on the right, is just a function of the UV coordinates ramped down and then added a sine wave. And suddenly you've got a vessel for a user interface design. And you can use that same sine wave to manipulate, tentacles on the left. And once you start using math or just thinking about stuff as something procedural or whatever you want to do, things become really interesting. So, for instance, if you take the UX in the middle, there's a hand coming out of the interface, grabbing a creature from the world. That entire interface is a 3D object stuck to the camera. So instead of having those two different worlds where UX and the game world are sort of separate, or separate camera or whatever, these are the same thing, and I can have this hand come out of one thing into the screen and interact. I thought it was super interesting. It's a new solution, a new thing I could do. I could fool around by having limited myself. I found a new way to do things, and it offered new opportunities. I think that's, for me, that is a huge drive, is to find new ways to do things, and self-limiting, adding creative limitations like using no textures and only geometry and shaders. It gets you interesting results. This is the game that's in the showcase now. It's called Falconeer. Everything in there is the same art style, just a little bit more evolved. It's about giant birds and air combat. There's lots of water in there. There's a little bit of Perlin noise I generate for snow and water. But the entire UX you see on the left is completely done without textures, except for the font, perhaps. Everything else is generated through rendered textures and geometry. And it can be quite involved, but it just shows you once you get into something, it becomes super powerful because you keep evolving and working on it. So what's the positives for me for doing it? I've done this over a decade. I'm doing my new game, which I'll show at the end. Also in the same art style. The first one is reduce the investment. I think that's very clear. Once you don't have to do an entire new art style, new art pipeline that usually comes with it, a new tech art, you can save a huge part of your studio, of your brain, if you're, in my case, a solo developer, by not having to do that again. Why reinvent the wheel? It's effort you can use somewhere else to be innovative in a different space. You don't need to innovate in your art space. Save that for gameplay or storytelling or whatever. I think that is a major thing that, the throwaway sort of game jam-esque approach from, we have a new game. It's out. It's not doing well. Throw it away. Come up with something new. Oh yeah, it needs a new art style. It's super excited, but it's very, it's throwaway. It's unfocused, and it doesn't allow you to also expand and evolve your art style, because that's the second thing that happens. Once you, commit to something, you put a decade into it. It starts to become natural. It becomes effortless in a way, and you can improve upon it, and it becomes really good after a while. There's a danger because it takes a while to get there, but once you're there, it really starts to pay dividends. And the final one is mastery. And mastery doesn't mean that you're always obsessively on that art. It means it truly becomes effortless to do things. You become so fast and instinctual in how you want things to do. You don't need to think about it. And again, that allows you to do new things with it, which you weren't capable before because you're still struggling getting the art right or the look. Everything I now make, I can go back to models I made a decade ago, put them in my latest game. They might need some bit more detail, but I can scale them. They work and they look fantastic. I don't have to worry about composition or atmospherics because I've already done those things. And I can just, tweak and play with it. So it becomes, for me, it's a lot more enjoyable and a lot more effortless. So there are negatives to doing this in, sticking by something. You can, there's a fear of getting stuck. You can, the spirit of the artist that's stuck in a tech that's no longer viable. The fun thing of our age is everything comes back. If you were a pixel artist in the early or late 90s, you might have felt like you were completely outdated. And now, there's a complete revival. It's a complete new genre and it's evolved technically. I know it exists, but I don't think, every time I think I'm stuck, I get to innovate in another field because I don't need to, necessarily focus all my energy in reinventing the world. And a game is so much more diverse than just the art style. Let the art style be recognizable and consistent for players. It's a bonus. It's not a negative, and you can put all your mind to innovating somewhere else where you are not stuck. So I think stuck is, it can be a positive in a way. There's the sunken cost fallacy that, once you put too much time in it, you can't get out of it because, you've sunk all this cost into it. That is a real, that is, it takes years to get somewhere, where you have your art style and you don't want to leave it. One of the things I've always done is that you can't do this with the door locked. You can't stay in your attic. You need to go out and see if what you're doing is still touching people. It's still appreciated. It's still readable as art. It's usable. And people enjoy it. So I've always gone out and showed people what I'm doing, just to get the validation that I'm not going down a one-way street where I can't return. So I think it's important if you do this, it's not to close the door, but be very open about it and put it out into the world so you get feedback and you can grow and not in the void, as it were. There is a technical risk. I think that's a real risk. If you spend 10 years something, you'll have your tool set, you'll have your shaders, your pipeline, and suddenly, I've had this engines go bankrupt. They quit being available for games, or they do something where it's not usable for yourself anymore. And suddenly you're you're stuck with technology that doesn't work. I think in what I'm proposing is not, to look at it just as a pipeline, but as a way of thinking. I am not super afraid of applying my art style to another engine because I know what I want. There's a certain mindset involved. Painful to lose all my tools, all my shaders and my set of stuff. But I know what I created. I know where the value is, and recreating something is usually less of an effort than reinventing it. So it is a risk, but it is, I think, a manageable risk, and the rewards are worth it. So for me, you pick your art style that fits. For me, the thing I enjoy most is atmosphere. Creating landscapes and atmosphere that work. And this art style is very good at it because it reduces everything to need to think about composition and color. And it doesn't, there's so little detail. You can only, those are the things you follow, and those are the things I enjoy, But if you're making a character-driven game or an adventure, you might take an entirely different art style that's much more, hand-drawn or pixel art or whatever. But once you stick to it, you can evolve it across various games. There's 3 games in a prototype here, including a stunting game, Wrecked, which I did the tech art for, which was, and the style still works. And every time it helps me understand it better and do more with it. My new games, because I like that, it also sort of guides you into finding new stuff. After the Falconeer, I had to sit, what did I enjoy? My wife asked me, what do you enjoy? I said, I enjoy making the landscapes and specifically the towns and castles of this world. I said, well, the game idea brings itself, you have created this art, this world. Why not reuse the entire world? And instead of flying around with it, which was the Falconeer, make it a city builder. And that is guided by, say, well, instead of having a percent game is gone, new game, to what have I got? What can I, use? How can I move on? And, that became a game where you build towns, and I've evolved the art style accordingly. So there's more detail on water. There's lots more detail than there ever was in the Falconeer, but it's the same open world. You can literally fly around it and recognize it. So I have no qualms. I'll update the vehicles, give them more detail, because this is a 30 FPS city builder that doesn't need, to be 120 FPS for maximum impact. So we can the game has different requirements, and we adapt to it and add to it. The water in this case is much more evolved, much more detailed. So let's have a look at the trailer for that.
The cycle begins anew. A new refuge, a haven, a bastion from which to rebuild. But this time we will succeed. We will build higher. We will build stronger. We will dream a new world. The cycle begins.
So sorry for that. So I wanted to end on this saying, as it were. The smaller the prison, the more interesting the breakout. I think it's not mine. I've heard it someone say it, so I don't know if it's a famous quote or not. But I love the idea of it. If you apply creative limits to yourself, if you put yourself in a prison, the breakout's going to be exciting because your brain can't wait to push against the walls and find a way out. The main thing that it does for me is that instead of making things more boring, because I've already done this 1,000 times for 10 years, by having this very strict rule set, I have to adhere to, everything becomes an exciting breakout. Everything becomes a search for a new way to, do something I've got in my head. Strangely, it's made it more creative, more interesting, more appealing to stick with it rather than to, go, oh, look, this is cool, hand painted or, claymation or whatever. Just stick with it and have those simple set of rules guide you. It becomes so satisfying. I have no words to express it. Just say, if you take the effort, there will be a reward. So the smaller the prison, the more interesting the breakout. And thanks for your time. I hope you enjoyed it.